Around the world, coal is still the largest single source of electricity. The U.S., China, and India burn huge amounts of coal, and 9% of Canada's electricity supply comes from burning coal, although our federal government has pledged to stop using it completely by 2030 to cut greenhouse gas emissions. But beyond greenhouse gases, burning coal produces a witch's brew of other kinds of pollution. Things like mercury, lead, sulfur dioxide, and soot particles. These can lead to a range of health issues for people living and working around coal plants. A new study has provided new numbers for just how big that health impact is. But the study also looked at a surprising secondary impact of coal burning, which found out that it's not just costing lives, it's also costing food. Jennifer Burney is an environmental scientist at the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Burney, welcome to Quirks and Quarks.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, give me the numbers. What did you find in terms of the costs of burning coal?
So this study looks at the United States, which has undergone a really dramatic transition in feedstock over the past decade or two, away from coal towards natural gas. And in this analysis, I found that the decommissioning of old coal-fired power plants led to saving around 26,000 lives. And in addition to that, almost 600 million bushels of corn, soybeans, and wheat in the surrounding areas over that time period.
Wow. What was the time period?
2005 to 2016.
Those are astounding numbers. How were you able to make the connections between, 26,000 lives saved and 500 million bushels of corn between that and coal-fired plants? Yeah,
so to attribute these kinds of changes to a coal-fired plant, it has to be done statistically. One of the things that's scientifically interesting about this transition in the United States is that there were many, many locations around the country, hundreds of units shut down. So it's really quite simple. We look at the changes in mortality before and after, or the changes in crop yields before and after, or changes in pollution before and after in these locations, and compare them to other places in the country that didn't have a coal unit shut down. And we see a statistically significant difference in places where you had a unit shut down. Deaths dropped and crop yields went up.
Boy. Well, I mean, it's understandable that we could have an idea of how coal pollution affects human health, but how would coal plants have had that much of an effect on agriculture?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different pathways by which air pollution impacts agricultural production. So the first is through production of aerosols, so suspended particles in the air. These aerosols in the air block incoming sunlight, so they may not have as much light available for photosynthesis, and that impacts productivity. The second pathway is through production of ozone near the surface. So coal-fired power plants, and actually natural gas plants as well, produce a lot of oxides of nitrogen and other compounds, which then evolve in the atmosphere and form ozone. Ozone is also something we're used to thinking about as harmful for people, but it is also directly harmful to plants. When it enters plants via the stomata, it causes direct tissue damage.
Now, how far away from the power plants was this effect seen?
The effects tail off with distance, but we still see even small effects out to about 200 kilometers.
Wow, that's astounding. Now, did it matter if the coal plants that were being shut down were older ones or newer ones that might have new technology on them, such as scrubbers that try to clean up the emissions from the stacks?
The numbers that I gave you are an average across all of the units that shut down. It does seem like the units that were shut down were among the older and dirtier of the units.
What went through your mind when you saw these numbers?
So two things went through my mind, and they're very contradictory. The first was, I'm not surprised. This is nothing new under the sun. We know that these types of pollutants are bad. We know that coal plants produce them. It's not surprising, therefore, that you see this signal. That was one reaction. On the other hand, and simultaneously, the other reaction was kind of a holy crap, these are huge numbers. And what really, really hit me was the geographic distribution of these impacts. We sort of think of the pollution associated with transportation or the pollution associated with electric power generation in this case as kind of this nebulous bad burden, but something that we all kind of share equally and don't really think about that much. For me, seeing the distribution of where these impacts were really made it clear to me that it is not a nebulous burden, and it is not one that is shared equally. It is very clearly concentrated. So it really drove home the sort of the local impacts of these decisions that we often think of in kind of a macro and aggregated way.
Now, your study was in the U.S. Would you expect to see the same patterns in places, well, like here in Canada, on our prairies, where we burn coal for electricity, or countries like India and China, which are really big, heavy coal users?
Yeah. Again, I think there might be some differences depending on technology and depending on the actual feedstock. So different types of coal, right, produce more or less sulfur. But one thing that the evolving literature on air pollution impacts has shown is that these effects are surprisingly consistent. We see that humans and crops are vulnerable to these pollutants no matter where they are.
So what effect do you think coal burning is having on the global food supply?
That's a great question. It's the thing I'm most excited to dig into next. I think air pollution is sort of this hidden damper on global food production. It's not something that many people think about. It's these pathways are not common knowledge in the way that human health impacts of air pollution are. So I do feel like it's almost like a weighted blanket, just pushing yields down a little bit all over the world.
Dr. Burney, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Jennifer Burney is an environmental scientist and associate professor at the University of California, San Diego.